Hello everybody and welcome to this Sunday Q&A and update on the war in Ukraine, or more to the point, as I've often put it over the course of the last 18 months now, the Russia-NATO war that takes place on the territory of Ukraine, because that's what this is really all about. So hello to everybody who has tuned in so far. So hello to Peter, Ash all the way from Melbourne, Irish Partisan, the comrade in Minsk, Kelly Bryan from Nagoya, Zuleika, hello, and hello to Jerry. And yes, I am also dog sitting. The dog in question may make an appearance at some point if she gets bored, so stand by for that one. But today we are, of course, looking at the war in Ukraine and the various associated events around it. I'm going to talk for a little while about all the things that have gone on since I last spoke about this, including the horrors of the so-called counter-offensive, which is just turning into exactly what anybody with eyes could tell that it was going to, and also some of the more grim realities around the Wagner organization. China telling Borrell to F off, and Yellen going over to China and doing some sustained groveling, and the ongoing stagnation and immiseration of life for the majority of people in Britain, and the crisis at the top of the British state, which is an ongoing issue, as I'm sure anybody who's listened to me for a while will know. So we will begin by saying hello to two more people in the chat. Hello to Rob and hello to Roddy. So, to begin with, the unfolding picture on the front line in Ukraine. There was, of course, last week the scare story over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which I'll come back to later. But to put this in context, of course, we had until the end of May, beginning of June, there was almost 6 months of essentially a long cinematic trailer being released by the Ukrainian puppet regime, which is what it is. It is an American puppet regime, regarding the potential for a great counteroffensive. And this great counteroffensive, they kept saying, was going to resolve everything. What took shape at the end of last year, when Mad Vlad Zelensky went on his cocaine-fueled dash to Washington, was that they were going to sweep south through the Zaporozhye region and then cut off Crimea, and then apparently Putin's regime would implode, the Russians would all soil themselves and run away, the glorious legions of the defenders of Western civilization would march into Crimea and presumably do what they did in Bucha. And this was going to be the plan. And they kept talking about this and talking about this and talking about this, whilst, of course, tens of thousands of Ukrainians died horrifically in places like Artyomovsk and other areas which the Russians successfully turned into what is termed a meat grinder. So this was trailed. They even released a cinematic trailer before the start of the offensive. And the offensive began and took place exactly where everybody had trailed it as going to be taking place, which was in the Zaporozhye region. And it turned into exactly what anybody who wasn't high on NATO or NAFO propaganda, NAFO about whom more later, and it turned into exactly what everybody who'd been observing this thought it was going to, which is that a force that was armed with a number of NATO-provided armoured vehicles and tanks, but with no air cover, and with their air defence essentially annihilated, other than the patchwork that's been able to be stitched together by the NATO countries of Patriot missiles and various other things that they've managed to get hold of from countries like Norway. But nothing like that what would be needed to prevent the Russians from having complete air supremacy. And it is exactly what has happened in terms of the results, which are that the Ukrainians moved through these dense Russian minefields, trying to clear them using these either the NATO provided mine clearance vehicles or some adapted versions of their own. And they got spotted by the Russians using either their satellite technology or their spotter planes or the many drones that the Russians now have available to them. And they spotted these columns moving in. They used artillery and air power and various other surface-to-surface missiles to destroy the armoured columns. You can see the pictures from almost a month ago now, trailing across the Ukrainian steppe. Large numbers of Leopard tanks destroyed, large numbers of Bradley armoured fighting vehicles destroyed, and thousands of Ukrainian forces killed. Many more wounded, horrifically so. So you have around about, according to various Russian estimates, Ukrainians are a lot more quiet on the subject, around about 20,000 dead, according to the latest estimates. They were dying at a rate of 1,000 a day at one point, and now it's been going on for over a month. And it has slowed down in recent days because, of course, they've run out of men. Or at least they're having more difficulty mobilizing and putting the men into action, and quite a number of them really don't want to go. Apparently more are surrendering now than ever before to the Russians whenever the opportunity arises. But of course, they have the Nazis, the Banderists as the enforcers in these units who are there specifically to shoot anybody who thinks about surrendering. And these are, of course, dragooned men. These are press-ganged men, quite a lot of them, who have been, I'm sure you've all seen the videos. They are swept off the streets of central and now western Ukraine as well, thrown into a van, thrown into a uniform, given a gun, given apparently like no more than 3 weeks training, and then shoved onto the battlefield. Now, it takes at least 6 months to train somebody to go into basic infantry roles in the British Army. At least that's what I can glean from the Ministry of Defence's own website. So it takes at least 6 months for them to be regarded as having basic competence to handle a weapon, to fight in a squad of men, to understand and carry out orders. And that's before you get into all the different military specialisms that exist out there. These guys are given 3 weeks training in Ukraine for the real, unfortunate term, but an accurate one, cannon fodder. And then they're given a couple of months training if they have the privilege of being taken to Italy, Germany, Britain, or if in the case of the special forces, I think they get longer, they get taken to the United States for that. But it is exactly what you would think. Poorly trained, poorly led, poorly equipped men going or being sent into defensive lines which the Russians have had since October of last year to build. So that's, 9 months now that they've been able to build up these defenses. And even the New York Times said back in the earlier part of this year that the Russian defenses were now at least 4 layers deep, and had, of course, the boost of many of the newly mobilized men who started being mobilized by the Russian Federation towards the end of last year. And they were brought in to reinforce the lines. And the effect has been, with complete air dominance and complete supremacy in terms of artillery, and now most likely in many areas of the front outnumbering the Ukrainians, it's exactly what everybody could see was going to happen has happened. The only way that you could possibly think that any other outcome than the mass slaughter that has occurred could occur is if you were completely high on NATO propaganda and you didn't look at anything else. And you didn't even look at the actual maps from the battlefield, even the maps from the Institute of the Study of War, this complete propaganda outfit run by the foreign policy hardliners in Washington. Even their daily maps that they release don't show any Ukrainian progress. So to believe that this was going to work, you would have to believe all the bullshit that the NATO propaganda machine had come up with for the last year, which is that the Russian army was weak, that it was ill-equipped, that it was running out of missiles, that it was ill-prepared to fight, that it was poorly led, that the men didn't want to fight, that they would run away at the first sign of NATO tanks. All turned out to be untrue. All turned out to be completely untrue. And as I've said before, the Russian government themselves were surprised by the fact that not only did the Russian masses understand the war and understand the need for it, but they embraced the need to fight it to victory. And again, this surprised the Putin government with the extent to which the Russian masses, beyond those who, of course, exist in the realm of the liberal spheres of St. Petersburg and Moscow, I'm talking about the Russian working class far beyond that, these people understood what was going on. They understood what the US was trying to do to Russia via the medium of Ukraine, using Ukraine as their tool. And so they're not going to run away. And of course, the Russian officers have had a year now in the special military operation, have a year to go through the ultimate training of facing this NATO-constructed Ukrainian army. And I'll return to a point I made many months ago when I was doing these updates in audio form, which is that this Ukrainian army that has been constructed, not just over the last year, because there's been several armies constructed over the last year, but since 2014, is of course essentially and has always been an outsourced army for the NATO countries, because the major NATO countries kept actually cutting their military budgets and have been cutting the numbers in their armed forces for over 30 years. Italy remains somewhat stable, but the other major countries like Britain, for instance, and the United States itself, the number of men they have available to actually fight wars has been shrinking over and over again. And this is true to this day. The government headed by Rishi Sunak still wants to do cuts to the military budget. So during the time when they were actually shrinking their numbers in their armed forces, they were growing the armed forces of Ukraine and flooding it with weaponry and money and training in order specifically to be the outsourced military force for the Western European countries that had deindustrialized and demilitarized themselves. And that they needed, essentially, the Ukrainians to act as their outsourced military force to confront the Russians. And now it's all going wrong in Ukraine, and even some of the dumb propagandists can see that it's all going wrong. One of Britain's most obnoxious propagandists, a certain obese Scottish gentleman by the name of Andrew Neil, ventured into print yesterday saying, well, how great it is that the Poles are remilitarizing, Poland is the shield of Europe, etc., etc. So it's clear. Andrew Neil, by the way, he used to be the editor of the Sunday Times. He's got a long history of being like an establishment hack. When he speaks, it's to give voice to an opinion of a certain section of the British ruling class. So when he says, oh, Poland, great job, lads, shield of the West, it's clear that some in the British, or more specifically the Anglo-American ruling class and the Anglo-American policy establishment, are looking at this and thinking, well, Ukraine's going down in flames, best big up Poland now. And it's clear that they want the Poles to play a similar role for them. And if I were a worker in Poland, or even one of the Polish petty bourgeoisie, I'd be looking at how Ukraine has been treated and sacrificed and thinking, well, no fucking way do I want anything to do with that. You don't need to be a communist to not want anything to do with that, because the level of complete and utter cynicism which the Americans, the British, and many others, France, Germany, have used Ukraine really over the last 30 years, but especially over the last 20, and even more so over the last 10. The way that that country has been used, and I've covered before what has been done to Ukraine since 1991, the fact that the judgment of some of the Russian Marxists is correct, which is that Ukraine was, first of all, subject to a vicious internal class war, that the parasitic Ukrainian capitalist class that emerged out of the old Soviet state and out of the hierarchy of that state and the remains of the old version of the Soviet-era Ukrainian Communist Party, that collection of parasites inherited one of the most industrialized areas in the Soviet Union. Remember, as I said the other day, the Soviet Union formerly consisted of many different republics, but only 3 of them were actually members of the UN and were recognized as like these independent states, even though they were, of course, all formally part of one country. Because Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, of course, were the ones who had which was argued by Yeltsin and his defenders, the legal power to dissolve the USSR, because these were all, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, were all independent states nominally. Whereas like the Central Asian states, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Baltic states, etc., these were republics, but they weren't recognized as independent. And therefore, according to the logic used by the Yeltsin defenders, the agreement signed to dissolve the USSR in 1991 was legal because it was the 3 independent states that were signing it. Now, that's something of a sidetrack, but that gives you an indication as to how elevated a position the Ukrainians held within the old USSR. One of the most industrialized parts of the old USSR. It was always the European USSR that had more even industrialization. That is largely a fault of Khrushchev and Brezhnev era policies, which sought to limit the industrial base of the Central Asian republics and places like Azerbaijan into being basically mono economies that served as sites of raw resource extraction. And they didn't properly use economic planning to bring up the level of those countries into being anything more than sites of resource extraction. It's a slight digression, but it gives you a clear idea of just how important Ukraine was in the USSR. It was a place where an awful lot of Red Army officers came from, an awful lot of the hierarchy of the USSR and the CPSU party and state came from there. So when it became independent in 1991, this was a country with huge economic potential. But of course, it comes into existence, it goes backwards into a less important mode of production. If you'll excuse me, I've got a barking dog, so I'm just going to pause for a second. Right, back again. There's a barking golden retriever there, so I needed to go and see whose leg she was tearing off. Looking after her for a while. So, yeah, the dog is very noisy but very friendly, and here she is. So, moving back onto the question of Ukraine, the Ukrainian capitalist class, of course, comes into existence as a purely oligarchic and purely parasitic entity. It has no capability of taking the country forward because, of course, it is, first of all, going back down to a lower stage of production and a stage of production which, of course, is inferior to the socialist system, and it shows its inferiority almost immediately by deindustrializing the country. At the same time, of course, the US is flooding Ukraine with all kinds of both money and returning loads of Ukrainian exiles from America and Canada to build up these fascist organizations. Because the plan is, as I've said many times before, the plan with Ukraine was always and again, this goes back to the Soviet period. It was always to try and use the fascist elements in Ukraine to act as a tool against the USSR. I mean, this was also the Hitlerite plan, and the Americans took it up after the war. So you get that long period of the guerrilla war in Western Ukraine, organized by the United States and the British after World War II, and this, of course, then causes a defeat of the fascist movement in Ukraine by the early 1950s. They go into exile across Europe, but mostly inside the United States and Canada, though there are some Ukrainian exiled fascist communities which you can find in Britain as well. I remember coming across some in Western Scotland, some old like Ukrainian monuments from the early 1950s, which must have been the place where some of these guys were in hiding. I'll pause for comments. Thank you, Ash. Yes, the dog is adorable and very, very noisy. Irish Partisan. The Ukrainian SSR had nearly 40% of the USSR's GDP. Heavy industry, light industries like textiles, auto industry, aerospace, IT, agricultural-based shipbuilding with a highly educated population. Yes, and to re-emphasize the point that Irish Partisan's making there, how abominable and abysmal capitalism is, and that huge productive base that existed there, Ukrainian capitalism and their imperialist allies in the West took it and flushed it down the toilet, deindustrialized, asset stripped it, turned Ukraine just to a site of agricultural production and raw resource extraction in the form of gas, and acting as a gas transit hub from Russia. So it's an absolutely horrific story, the restoration of capitalism in the whole of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine is the absolute peak of like what an atrocious mess the restoration of capitalism has made. And this is the grisly denouement that is going on right now. It is the final horror show that the Ukrainian ruling class have created, because they immediately became the puppets of the US imperialists and willingly became their tools in a long-term campaign to essentially finish the job of destroying the Russian Federation itself. Because as soon as the USSR collapsed, the most aggressive elements in the US foreign policy establishment knew very well that, well, Russia, for all it had been destroyed by its treacherous comprador bourgeoisie, they knew very well that eventually something would emerge in Russia that sought to re-establish the writ of the Russian state over the entire territory and redevelop the economy. And they knew very well that they couldn't allow that. Ukraine was one of their chosen tools to try and stop that. There was a long period of political contestation, a long period of class war inside Ukraine itself, where the Ukrainian Communist Party was able to provide some resistance to the worst things that the Ukrainian oligarchy wanted to do, but eventually they were overcome for reasons I've gone into in previous programs. But the other, of course, move that the British and the Americans made was to try and fund and arm the jihadists in the Caucasus, which is, of course, why Kadyrov's father, Akhmat Kadyrov, turned against the campaign for Chechen independence and realized that essentially they were being turned into tools of the British and the Americans, so cut a deal with the Russian government instead. Further, Oswhistle says, I find it fascinating to live at a time when we observe in gory detail the real term exactly how the Tower of Babel works. Well, interesting take. I'm not a biblical man myself, but I do appreciate the drama. Irish Partisan says, Belarus never deindustrialized thanks to Lukashenko. Belarus is not only a major food producer, but also in potash, automobiles, agricultural machinery, Belaz trucks used across the whole world, and an IT hub. Well, I think as I've said before, the legacy of a guy like Lukashenko will be regarded much more positively in the future. I mean, if you were around the British left 10 years ago, as I was, Lukashenko wasn't even discussed. He was just dismissed as like a Kremlin puppet, which has never been true, given that there was a long-running dispute between Belarus, Lukashenko, and first Yeltsin and then Putin over what exactly the Union state was going to be and how that was going to take shape. But the achievement that he's carried out there is remarkable in managing to keep that industrial base together, managing to stop the worst things that happened to Ukraine, which of course Belarus was a much more and is a much more rural part of the USSR, the old USSR, than Ukraine was. If only Ukraine had had a Lukashenko figure who could have done what Lukashenko did in 1994, which is come in, stamp on, in a very literal sense, the gangsterist elements, the open fascist elements, and impose essentially a progressive form of Bonapartism. If that had been done with Ukraine, then we might not be in this position today. So it's a testament to Lukashenko and, of course, the other forces in that country, including the Belarusian Communist Party, that support the current form of government there, that didn't happen, and that they do have an independent industrial base. So moving back to the question of Ukraine, the Ukrainian working class has essentially been sacrificed by these most wretched forms of capitalist class you could ever possibly find. They are completely, and have been since really the 90s, or at least the Orange so-called revolution in 2003-4. They're completely in the thrall of US imperialism. They have willingly turned the country over to the US imperialists. And ever since then, I mean, now you have the pathetic conclusion to this, which is Zelensky declaring English to be the second language behind Ukrainian now. Just, by the way, as is the same as you would have heard Jyoti Brar talk about that in the interview with regard to South Korea. If you listen to the interview I did with Dermot Hudson of the KFA recently, you heard him say the same thing, which is like South Korea, like because it's an occupied nation, the compradors there just adopt like all the English and American mannerisms, and also, of course, the language. And Zelensky is loyally doing the same thing. I mean, it really is pathetic for an area of the world with this very rich culture that is, of course, inherently linked to Russian culture, or it might just be Russian culture, in fact, with all of these traditions that should be valued. And what do? They just become these like pathetic lickspittles of the American empire. And this relates directly to the war, of course, because, again, you go back to the old phrase from Clausewitz: war is a continuation of policy by other means. And what does that mean? Well, the war that is being fought, that was planned for by the imperialists and, of course, collaborated with by the local comprador oligarchy, well, it reflects exactly the role that Ukraine is to play, which is Ukraine is not to have an industrial base. Their role is in the American international imperialist system is not to have an industrial base. It is at best to be used as a grain production site and maybe as a site of gas extraction, if the Russians allow them to keep any of that, which I don't think they will. And the question over, well, how this war is organized is answered by, well, just look at how they've done it, which is that Ukraine is essentially just turned into two things: a place to be looted by the Wall Street firms and the City of London firms that are the vanguard of British and American imperialism, and also to be acting as a giant area of cannon fodder. The entire Ukrainian male population, everybody from like 15 to 75, it seems, is being mobilized. There's been plenty of reports confirmed now of the Ukrainian armed forces mobilizing teenage boys to fill the ranks, press-ganged men off the street, people who are picked up and brutalized and thrown into the front. I mean, this is like the absolute epitome of like a disgusting comprador regime. The fact that it is essentially overseen completely the wholesale destruction of the country over the last 30 years, concluding with the physical annihilation of the Ukrainian working class. So it's a long-term horror, and it just goes to show that what was done in Ukraine after 1991 was done across the Soviet Union. The only way you could possibly regard that as progressive is if you stand to profit personally from it, or your class stands to profit from it. It is a completely reactionary nightmare that is playing out to its now grisly conclusion on the Ukrainian steppe. So this is what happens when a comprador elite seizes control of a country and then destroys all elements of working class resistance. Remember, the first thing they wanted to destroy was the Ukrainian Communist Party and the trade unions, those that were, of course, left in central and western Ukraine. The eastern Ukrainian communists and trade unionists joined the resistance against the Maidan coup regime. But again, war is a continuation of policy by other means, and the policy of the Ukrainian oligarchy is to essentially just sacrifice the entirety of the Ukrainian nation for the purposes of lining their own pockets. And the only way they could do that was if they made themselves subservient to US imperialism. And now, even if they wanted to get out, they can't. They're completely locked in to this horror that has been unleashed. And it is a horror. And of course, we must remind ourselves that, of course, the Ukrainian government, Zelensky, if he was a man of any courage at all, which he's not, he's a coked up actor, could have signed that agreement to end the war over a year ago. And hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians would still be alive. But of course, the Americans gave him an order and he loyally carried it out. And now there's no way out for Zelensky. He will sink with this regime, unless, of course, he ends up in his exile in Miami. Go back to questions. Oswhistle says, I'm not biblical either, but I see patterns. I agree with all you say, but I understand that people are not ready to hear most of my insights in the big picture and how this is actually not important. Policy is by nature retrospective and inherently maladaptive if prioritized over the evidence of your own senses, as are all institutions. Well, feel free to put out whatever message you want to in the chat, as long as it meets the usual guidelines of respectability. Irish Partisan says, I can see a major escalation in the war. Too many people in Washington, Brussels and London have invested too much political and economic capital in Project Ukraine to back down now. Yes, they have, which is why Tobias Ellwood, who's this abominable wretch of a British MP, is going on Sky News and giving hysterical interviews about the need for martial law. Where I would differ from Irish Partisan's analysis there slightly is that I think there's many people in Washington and London who'd love to escalate somehow, but they don't have the means to. Now, bear in mind, we're now going to go back to something I frequently revisit, which is the capability of the Western powers to actually do any kind of further escalation. Now, realistically, there is no way that the British can go and have a fight with the Russian Federation and not be destroyed. Even the British military hierarchy admits they don't have enough planes, they don't have enough ships, they don't have enough men. The most that the British Army can organise in terms of an actual fighting capacity, according to even their own experts, is 20-odd thousand men. By the way, 20-odd thousand men who, at most, would have seen some combat with the Taliban, maybe, and even then, not very much of it, given that the British and the Americans ran away. And what, they're going to go up against the Russian army? That's an idea that's so bad, even like the military commanders in London can see it's an appalling idea. And how many men can the Americans mobilize? According to most estimates, it's what? Fighting capacity, 250,000 if they pulled men from all over the world. Now, they might. But then again, you need to get them into Europe, and you need to then supply them, not just have them go in and act like it's a police action. So the problem with all of this idea that keeps floating around from the ultra-reactionaries in Europe and the United States is, well, if they're going to intervene, then they just simply don't have the capacity to do it. They could send 100,000 men into Ukraine, and the Russians could wipe them all out very quickly. So what are they going to do? That's why I pointed out that article by Andrew Neil earlier on about singing the praises of Poland, the great shield of Western civilization. If there's going to be anything happens, then it'll be what they will want is to find other proxies to act for them. And this isn't just a matter of capacity either. It's also a matter of stability in the internal life of the Western powers, which is that for the last 50 years, since the end of the Vietnam War, they have desperately avoided any getting entangled in a confrontation with somebody who can possibly win. Now, we covered on the last stream where we talked about this, the fact that they didn't even want to go in for a fight with the Yugoslav army in 1999 when they had complete air supremacy. They didn't even want to get into a fight with the Yugoslav army on the ground then. And that was against an army that had been, well, it still was quite formidable in terms of the weaponry it could wield, in terms of the determination and the fighting capacity of the soldiers. But the NATO powers had complete air supremacy and could pulverize everything into dust, but they still didn't want to risk an open ground war. They wanted to get Milosevic to capitulate. And again, they went in for Gulf War One against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which, as Martinov and others have pointed out, the capacity of the Iraqi army was not great, to say the least. It had been through 8 years against the Iranians and had come off worst from it. And then they sat there for 6 months in Kuwait doing nothing, and then eventually tried to withdraw, and the Americans blew the crap out of them when they weren't even shooting back. That's not exactly a war. And then what? They went in and invaded Iraq when it had been under sanctions for over a decade, and the army basically collapsed. And by the way, Saddam Hussein and his army commanders were, by, again, all accounts by independent military analysts, abominably bad military commanders. Appalling. Like they could even have inflicted some severe damage on the Americans with the diminished forces they had in 2003, but they failed to do so because apparently Saddam and his men were still far too more worried about the activities of the Iranians than they were the Americans, even when the American tanks were rolling up the highway. So what have these armies in the West fought for the last 50 years? What was the last major war the French fought? It was actually the war in Algeria. And they lost. So, you know what, the British managed to beat the Argentines just in 1982 to 83. So these aren't forces that have won anything in a very long time. Remember, they lost in Vietnam. The French lost in Vietnam as well. The Americans lost the Korean War. Admittedly, it was the country was partitioned, but they received a severe beating there. So the last real war these guys won was World War II, and even there, they won it basically because the Soviet Union destroyed the Wehrmacht. So it's a question of, well, what are they going to use to go in there? Do they have the capacity to do it? Do they have the political capacity to mobilize for a war against the Russian Federation? I think the answer to that is no. Now, I don't rule out them going on some mad propaganda campaign about Russian atrocities and trying to drum up some kind of support there. But again, the connection between the British government and the masses of the population here is very weak. Same with the French government. You can see that just from the response to the riots in France. Same with the Americans. They haven't had any capacity they had for mass mobilization in a foreign war was killed off by the Vietnamese in the late 60s, early 70s. That's why they're talking up Poland. That's why they're trying everything they possibly can to avoid going in themselves, because they know what will happen. Again, and this is another area I agree with people like Andrei Martinov, who I disagree with on a whole range of other issues, but he's right when he says, well, the Russians aren't even fighting a war right now. It's still a special military operation. So if the Poles decide that they're going to go in and make war on the Russian army, what do you think is going to happen to Poland? Well, the British ruling class know very well, or some of the more intelligent of them know very well what the Russians will do to Poland. They'll fucking level it. And again, Poland on its own doesn't have the military industrial capacity to be able to sustain a giant army in the field in Ukraine against Russian Federation forces that if there's the slightest movement from the Baltic states or from Poland towards Belarus, well, they'll annihilate all the military facilities inside Poland. And the Polish population won't want anything to do with that. Now, will the Polish compradors just do it anyway? There's a possibility of that. But again, like, none of these people have half a clue, like, what is going to happen if they make war on the Russian Federation. The military men probably know, and the intelligence men know, and even some of the politicians have an inkling. I think Rishi Sunak, for all that he's a bland idiot, does have an inkling that he couldn't get away with sending a vast army, a British army, into Crimea. This is not the 1850s. He is not Lord Palmerston. And then, by the way, even though they won that war in Crimea, the British forces did not perform well there at all. There's a whole poem about it. So, I'll go back to the comments. Very pertinent point. Peter says, pertinent point from Irish Partisan. What are the conditions that will lead them to realise that they've lost and that they must come to some kind of peace, or is this turning into a suicide mission? Oswhistle says, the UK is the most nukeable geography on planet Earth. Best of luck. I have a cave close by I can go to. I'm not worried too much. Irish Partisan says, ineffective, could be soon. He puts the current strength of the Russians at approximately 800,000. Well, the various estimates of the Russian military that I've seen from all kinds of people range between 800,000 to over 1 million. They can mobilize up to a further 2.5 million men if required, with millions more beyond that. And even the Western media is now admitting that in terms of the essentials of military production, so shells, bullets, all kinds of armored vehicle production, aircraft production, what the Russian Federation has done in terms of its economic and industrial strategy, certainly over the last decade, has borne fruit now, in that they are outproducing the United States and the Europeans by a country mile. So again, yeah, we can drive the British army into Western Ukraine, it all gets destroyed. How are you going to replace the Challenger tanks that the Russians will blow up? You can't just conjure up, like Tobias Ellwood and people like that, think that you can just conjure up like some kind of military industrial capacity out of nothing. To do that, you would actually need to go back to like the level of economic planning and intervention that was done by like the coalition government led by Churchill in World War II. And that's when the British had the resources of the empire at their disposal. For all that British imperialism still moves a lot of capital around and exploits a lot of places, they haven't got those kind of resources anymore. And they know they don't, which is again why they're talking up Poland and why they'll try and talk Romania into fighting for them. Peter says, excellent answer. We have constantly to look behind the propaganda the media sharts out and examine the material reality of weaponry and personnel. Yeah, you cannot escape the material reality. Now, the global system that American imperialism designed after 1991. Now, bear in mind, they got lucky with what happened in the 1980s. Very lucky. They got lucky in that the Soviet leadership had degenerated to the point where the whole thing just ran away from itself and imploded, because you got the unique combination of a moron in charge in the form of Gorbachev, and it revealed chronic weaknesses in the Soviet party, whereby that they were not able to remove in time a leadership that had essentially run out of control. If the party had managed to act, and there was still a huge working class influence in the party, if the party had managed to act and get rid of Gorbachev and shoot the fucker for treason by 1987, things could have worked out differently. But by 1989, it was too far gone. So, Red Star Betty says, some chattering class attempt to big up Poland as a European power lately. Rather hollow, really. Yes, rather hollow, but they're hoping Poland now plays the role of outsourced military for them like Ukraine did. And if I were a Pole looking at that, I would want to overthrow any politician who would go anywhere near that. Other thing to bear in mind is Poland is not a really independent country. Poland's economic development since the early 90s has been dependent upon a gigantic amount of subsidy coming from the Europeans mainly the Germans, which makes the bitch fit that they're having with each other even more amusing. And without that gigantic amount of subsidy, there is not much of a Polish economy. So Poland is more dependent upon both German and American imperialism than they ever were dependent upon the Soviet Union during the socialist period. They have far less independence now than they did in the 1970s and 1980s. That's the reality of restoration of capitalism across all these countries. All the talk by the bourgeois opposition in the 80s about sovereignty and all that shit, all that just basically meant the restoration of private property rights. That's all it came down to. That's what their version of sovereignty means. It's what it's always meant, going all the way back to the days of the Enlightenment philosophers. Sovereignty, rule of law, respect for the individual, all takes root from respect for the private property rights of the bourgeoisie. And that's all they really care about. And they transpose that onto bigger ideals such as national sovereignty, independence, that kind of thing. But what it comes down to, rule of the minority, rule of the capitalist class, and the defense of the property rights of the capitalist class against the working class. So, where are we now? Ash says, do you think NATO and co really believed the counteroffensive would go well and they would expect their upcoming conference to be a place to promote an escalation? Interesting question. Now, this answer will depend upon how we view the Prigozhin events. Were the Prigozhin events pre-planned by the US and British intelligence services? Was it the fact that they knew that the Prigozhin events were going to come and that they could see that there would be an opportunity arising for them to try and instigate some kind of Russian state collapse? And then they could go into the NATO conference with Russia in chaos and say, we've won. And then drive a bargain to end the war with whoever follows the evil Putin and sign a deal with him. Their ideal, by the way, was never Prigozhin. Prigozhin was a tool to them at best. If he could create enough chaos, if he could destabilize the government to the point where Putin was forced out, that was his role. His role was never to become president, and he wouldn't have become president. Their ideal would have been to shove some exiled oligarch in there if they could, or do a deal with somebody else in the current Russian power structure. Maybe that was their plan. And there is always the possibility, to go back to Ash's question, that they were completely high on their own supply. They've been bullshitting for far too long about their own capacities, about the fact that they have portrayed the Russian Federation as still being the Yeltsin era, as like still being the case that they could just turn up with a briefcase full of money, buy a couple of oligarchs and a bunch of state officials, and then they could get control of the Russian government again, or that the Russian government would get flipped by the oligarchs. And it has turned out not to be the case. Again, I go back to my old assertion that Putin should be seen as a kind of liberal Bonapartist. If you look at the changes to Russian state structure, if you look at the changes to the legal system that he's done there, what he's actually been trying to do in a unique way is trying to put in place a system of essentially liberal constitutionalism. Where, again, to go back to what I was just saying, which is where capitalism in Russia is essentially saved from itself by the imposition of a Bonapartist system, but where they try and grow institutions that are at least nominally about the old bourgeois principle of the rule of law, about having a respectable constitutional order. Now, that's good advertising for external investors, and it, of course, is something that which capitalists like to see. But it is the fact that things like the Russian legal system have become overwhelmingly more liberal in the last 20 years. Much to the point now where it's actually complained about by communists and Russian bourgeois nationalists that the system's too soft. So what the NATO countries and their intelligence services are doing is relying on this false impression of Russia from like almost 30 years ago, from like the end of the middle period or the end period of the Yeltsin years. And even then, I think the estimation of like Russian military weakness was way over the top. I mean, the Russian military still retained a lot of key capacities all the way through the bad years of the 90s. So the question over where they're getting their bullshit from, well, they're getting it from Russian exiles. They're getting it from exiled oligarchs who essentially are being paid to create an endless feedback loop of garbage to tell the Western intelligence agencies what they want to hear, to tell the political masters what they want to hear, which is then recycled through the bourgeois press and then comes back to the idiot politicians who then say, wow, Russia's really weak. Because you've got to bear in mind that, like, the people in the British cabinet, most British MPs, these are not intellectually curious people by any means. If you're in the governing party, if you're in the Conservative Party, it doesn't pay to be intellectually curious to any degree. A lot of them, what the biggest unifying factor in British political life, British bourgeois political life, is that they are all high on British imperialism. They have been living in a fantasy world since 1956, where Britain is still as powerful as it ever was because they cleverly adapted themselves to sort of run in the slipstreams of US imperialism, so they could still be regarded as like one of the big dogs, so to speak. And a lot of in fact, most of the MPs in Parliament imbibe this, because this is just all part of the bourgeois ideology that gets forced into your head in Britain at a very early age anyway. But if you're in a power structure, this is something which is absolutely drummed into you. And if you deviate from it, then your career ends very quickly. So you have all these politicians who aren't particularly intellectually curious, who rely upon either intelligence briefings, which again, when it comes to Russia, are just taken from bullshit that they've derived from exiled oligarchs and other people and liberal circles in St. Petersburg and Moscow, which tell these intelligence men what they want to hear, and from like mainstream media, which again, this bourgeois press just recycles the stuff from the intelligence services and the oligarchs and their sources in Russia, which are all the same group, and it just comes out again at the other end with some dickhead making a speech in Parliament about, oh, how weak Russia is, how weak Putin is, Putin, terrible, fragile regime, etc., etc. They've never read any books on it. They've never even picked up a book like a guy we've mentioned on the program before, like Richard Sakwa or Richard Connolly, or any of the people who've done any serious academic studies of the Russian economy since the 2000s. So at least since the 2008 financial crash, which is the start of significant changes and reversals in policy by the Putin government, where they moved away from the policies of deindustrialization and actually started a policy, which I'm working on an article about this at the moment, which is where they started carrying out significant state intervention, rebuilding the agricultural sector, which they destroyed in the 90s and 2000s to make Russia self-sustaining in food again, building on the legacies of the Soviet Union, both in industrial and agricultural terms, to the point where they're now self-sustaining in food supply. By 10 years ago, they were self-sustaining in food supply, got there very quickly after the sanctions packages were introduced after 2014. But nobody paid any attention to this. Nobody in the power structure, even the intelligence men, weren't paying any attention to it because the politicians didn't want to hear it. And the intelligence men's job, even though apparently it is to gather facts, they were then just presenting completely ideological pictures to the British cabinet, to the American political hierarchy, about how if we just gave, the old phrase from Hitler, if you kick the door in, the whole rotten structure tumbles down, which he was referring to the Soviet Union, which was not true then. And again, who was Hitler relying on? Apparently he was an avid reader of Trotsky's articles. Apparently he read like The Revolution Betrayed, and he would point his generals to it and say, see, Stalinism popular. See, the Soviet regime is isolated. See, we'll go in and we'll be able to conquer it in days. Again, relying on an exile who had a grudge to exercise and whose assessment was completely out of whack with the reality. And that's what they're doing now. So to a large extent, to go back to your question, they thought that they would have something to announce. I think that their ultimate hope, the more realistic of them, was that there would be some kind of breakthrough that could be spun as a victory to the West, that something would come up, that they would, because in the initial period of the assaults in Zaporozhye, they did target some of the mobilized men who'd been recently added to the Russian defensive lines. And they clearly hoped that the sight of the formidable NATO armory that they'd supplied would be too much for the Russian mobilized men, and they would all turn tail and run. And of course they didn't. They stood and fought and inflicted massive damage on the Ukrainian forces. So I think that they thought they'd at least have a propaganda victory by the Vilnius summit. And as it stands at the moment, they've got nothing. So what are they going to do? Other than engage in some bullshit about security guarantees to Ukraine, they don't have a way forward now at all. They also hoped that somehow the Russians will be convinced just to stop and just to offer to freeze the conflict. I think that's maybe what the talks led by former Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haas were all about. All right, I'll move on to the next comments. Victor says, why are the Russians dragging it out? Many reasons for that, Victor. Firstly, the special military operation has evolved through several different phases to the point where it is at now. The initial phase back in February to March of last year was just about forcing Zelensky to do a deal to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk and then leave it at that and not join NATO, of course. Now, that was a deal that almost got signed. When Biden ordered Zelensky not to sign, then you've got the need for a change in Russian tactics, which took the better part of like half a year from March to October to change over to mobilizing, to getting more men into the field. And then it took another, 9 months beyond that to the point where the Russians are now actually outnumbering the Ukrainians in key areas of the front line. So what you've got is a situation where you've had several different phases of this special military operation, each evolving towards the Russians mobilizing more men and resources, to the point where eventually they will need to go on some kind of offensive when the Ukrainians have been ground down. Though I think that the Kremlin is clearly hoping that either the Americans call time on this and sign some sort of bargain, or the Ukrainian state just collapses. But I have my doubts about that. Yes, Irish Partisan is right. We need to pay attention to the outcome of the NATO summit next week in Vilnius. Now, that takes place next week. I will be doing live streams on each day covering that, so tune in for those. Zuleika says, postmodernist military policy, magical thinking. Zuleika is absolutely right. There's so much magical thinking in the Western capitals now, especially Britain. And that all derives from the fact that how British capitalism makes its profits now is not based really upon manufacturing anything. It's based on moving capital around the world, just moving numbers on a balance sheet. It's not based on the visible production of commodities inside Britain anymore. And because that, it gives you an air of unreality in everything, that unreality then spills over into policy. And that's why you've got like British politicians just living in a complete fantasy world, because they don't have to deal with the realities of commodity production anymore. That's all outsourced, all overseas, all done elsewhere. All they do is essentially run a machine, which is the British government, which is tuned towards specifically just facilitating flows of capital into London and out of London again. That's all it's there for. And to, of course, secure British investments overseas and periodically engage in small-scale military campaigns where they can brutalize some poor small country into giving up its resources to Britain. And you ask them to think on a bigger scale or be confronted with the reality of a giant industrial power like what Russia has become again, they can't handle it, because they've not had, you've now had 2 generations of political leaders in Britain who never had to handle anything like that. And they can't. They can't. That's why they're getting hysterical. That's why they're going nuts. It's why they're turning on Biden and the Americans, because, of course, Biden refused Ben Wallace the job that Ben Wallace thought he was entitled to, which is NATO Secretary General. So, going on then. It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. Zuleika is correct. Irish Partisan. Dima from Military Summary Channel says that the deal to release Azov Nazis was a way by Erdogan to give Russia legal right to pull out of the grain deal. Next phase will be Black Sea and Odessa. I think that's correct. I think that Erdogan, of course, is playing his usual games, balancing between the Americans and the Russians and various other powers, and trying to keep his position in NATO, trying to still keep that faint hope of EU membership alive for Turkey, which of course isn't going to happen. So the release of those Azov Nazi guys, I mean, that really isn't doing the Azov guys any favors. Because essentially the Kiev regime is going to return them to military duty at some point soon. They'd have done better sitting on a beach in Turkey until this thing was over. But as of now, they are going to be thrown back into the line, or the Russians are going to find out where they are and kill them. So Zelensky's won nothing. Erdogan has cleverly given Zelensky the appearance of a victory, but it's only the appearance of a victory. The Turkish policy is not going to change. They're still not going to change their abiding by the Montreux Convention, which doesn't allow any more warships into the Black Sea. They're still not going to stop dealing with the Russians over energy and finally trying to resolve the situation in Syria or any of the other deals they've got going with the Russian Federation, because that's turning into quite good business for the Turks. So, again, Zelensky's won nothing through that. We've got a lot of Russians very angry, but I think doesn't those Azov men no favors at all. They're all going to end up dead now, or just if they're sensible, they'll get themselves a deal where they go into exile in the United States and maybe get a job lecturing at Stanford or Harvard. So yes, I think it was going to work out this way, I think, from the moment that Biden crushed those peace talks last year. Now there's going to be no way out except on the Russian terms. And the Russian terms, I think, will mean going all the way to Odessa, taking all of the Ukrainian coast, and then essentially stopping, perhaps, and then challenging the United States to come up with some kind of formula to end the conflict. But I doubt that there's anything there, and I'll come to the Richard Haas talks in a minute, actually, because there's more to say about that. But yeah, the minimum now is going to be Novorossiya, which is going to be everything from probably Kharkov all the way down through Lugansk and Donetsk, all the way through Zaporozhye, Kherson, down to Odessa, the historic old Russian city, and they're going to take all of it. And you know what? It'll be better. It'll be much better off for the people living in those areas than living under the Kiev Comprador regime. Okay, where are we now? Hitler was a fan of Trotsky's writings. How perfect is that? We'll remember that for the next SWP type scold I bump into. Yes, make a note of that one, Red Star Betty. Victor says, wonder why they always get disgruntled oligarchs to analyse Putin and Russia. Comes back to what I was saying earlier, Victor. The politicians in London, and I've met some of these politicians in my previous role as a trade unionist, they just want to be told what they want to hear. They don't want to hear anything that challenges their narrative. They don't want to hear that Russia's actually rebuilding, that its economy is becoming stronger, that its industrial base is expanding, that it's reversing a lot of the damage that was done in the 90s. They don't want to hear any of that. They want to dwell in a world where it's always 1996, where Yeltsin owes his position to the West, because remember, the man who won that election in 1996 in Russia was the communist Gennady Zyuganov. And they want to live in a world where they can dictate to everybody. So they can't deal with this world as it stands right now. So they get oligarchs, or exiled oligarchs, to lie to them and pretend that it is the reality when it's not. Zuleika says, the lack of intelligence and knowledge of anything real in the current iteration of our political class is astonishing. Prideful ignorance and idiocy abound. Well, exactly. I mean, our political class can't even tell you what a woman is these days. So why on earth would they understand the economic situation of the Russian Federation or the massive role that the Chinese play in the global economy? They don't understand any of those things either. And again, it all comes back to the fact that these are deindustrialized societies, principally basing their economies on the movement of capital, and they have essentially just gone on to autopilot now for 30 years, sitting within their place within the American imperial system, which is meant to be able to strangle the life out of any potential opposition using a combination of economic sanctions, because of course, other than the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, everybody has to be in the international system. Therefore, everybody has to use SWIFT and other things like that. Everybody joins the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and therefore everybody's economy can either be throttled out of existence by the Americans using those institutions and using their control of the international financial system, or subjected to a bombing campaign run by American air power and mercenary operations, either through jihadists or Nazis or just mercenaries of all kinds that can be brought in to fight for them. And that's the other big group that's in Ukraine right now, various mercenaries from all the way across the world. Ash says, what do you think of the US officials, ex-US officials having peace talks with the Russians? Well, it's an inevitable development carried out by those who are still in possession of a functioning brain, like Haas and others, who can see that there's no chance of Ukraine or the Ukrainian compradors prevailing, and also that there's very little chance, next to no chance, of being able to mobilize a US force to go in there and fight the Russians. So they need a way out. Now, the problem is that Haas and the others went into these talks, and essentially just it was talks about talks, because the Russian position, since the Biden administration kiboshed those talks in March, April last year, since Biden killed those via the medium of Boris Johnson, there's been no chance of getting any actual serious peace negotiations on the go. And the Russian position has hardened, partly because of the actions of the United States, but also because, of course, domestic opinion in Russia is like 80 to 90% in favor of pushing this war to its conclusion. And Putin can't afford to ignore that. The strength of his internal position stems from the fact that, of course, the population is now solidly behind the war policy. There's now a considerable number of Russian dead. Of course, many thousands died in Artyomovsk alone, thanks to the tactics pursued by Prigozhin and Wagner. And with that amount of sacrifice, one of the biggest Russian sacrifices, I think now there's going to be more that died in this than died in the Chechen wars. Probably more died in this than died in the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which I will come back to and do a full program on at some point. So this is going to be one of the biggest Russian sacrifices in terms of lives lost since World War II. And with everything that has gone on and the fact that the Americans have proven so treacherous in terms of their inability to stick by an agreement, Putin, even if he wanted to sign a deal with the likes of Haas or talk about a deal with Haas and others, he can't back off at least getting the minimum of what Irish Partisan commented on, which is getting the Novorossiya and then seeing if a negotiation can be held to essentially save a Ukrainian rump state. Moving on to the next comment. And the unreality is from Zuleika, and the unreality is why they don't need to have any knowledge of history, science, and philosophy. Well, exactly the point. Again, speak to anybody in the American or British political hierarchy. They are absolutely frighteningly ignorant of even British history, even the history of this country. Like, they have a cartoon level understanding of it. And that goes for people on the right and the left, by the way. Tories, right-wingers of various descriptions have a cartoonish and idiotic view of British history. Left-wingers do too, from a slightly different perspective. And it's because there's no serious study of, history, philosophy. Philosophy's barely taught in Britain. You can do university courses on it, but I've done some, and they're not very good, quite frankly. Most of what I've learned about philosophy has come through my own independent study, which I would encourage everybody to do. It's hard to get started with like trawling your way through the works of Plato, but it's ultimately very rewarding, and it's much better for you than what the university system's got to offer. As for science, well, Britain's meant to be like a world leader in science, and I believe, I don't know enough, but I knew some people who were involved in like chemistry and biology at like PhD and above, the academic levels. And there's still some good stuff that gets done with regard to these areas of work in British universities. But in terms of the actual capacity of Britain to do anything in these areas, they're being massively outstripped by like the Chinese. And, of course, they're outstripped already by the Americans, but the American position's being eroded due to the degeneracy of American capitalism. So all the things that would make like a political class or a class of administrators any good whatsoever. Of course, impossible to foster in this atmosphere of decaying imperialism, because, of course, the rot starts at the economic base, which is rotting imperialism, which is just about moving capital out of the country. It's not about investing anything, building anything. All you need to be able to do is to press return on your keyboard to create more money via quantitative easing, buy up government debt with from another part of the government with another part of the government, and of course make sure that the machine keeps ticking. And again, this does not create an atmosphere where a high degree of education or proficiency in these areas is needed. All that's needed is the ability to say yes sir and keep the machine running. Moving on to Peter. Politicians live in their financial services fantasy bubble, wouldn't get away with any of their venal madness if they had to contend with a militant, well-organised working class. What is to be done? Good question. I'm sure drawing from the Lenin question there. Well, the question is answerable in the form of a rather obvious response, which is that until the British and American working class, and of course the French, German, Italian, Spanish as well, get organised to the point where we can overthrow this system, or at least challenge it to the point where its wild madness has to be reined in, then things are going to continue as they are. Now, this will have to happen. There will have to be a response from the working class. The job of communists is to build up our forces and connections with the masses to the point where when the class moves into action, then we can be there to actually guide that action to a degree, but also then make greater connections with the masses when more of them move into action. At the moment, what we're in is the period of preparation, the period where we have to recognize the abysmal state of the left, the abysmal state of the working class movement in terms of the leaders of the working class movement, in terms of the working class movement's organizations, all of which are appalling, no matter whether you're in Britain, the United States, or most other of the imperialist countries. Those organizations are rotten, and the sooner you realize that they are rotten and that we have to start from scratch in a lot of areas, including the building of communist parties, then the sooner we will be able to move forward. But the answer is always that the working class has to be organized anew, has to be raised. No other way forward is available to us. There's all kinds of false paths that we could try and go down, whether it's like Sarah Wagenknecht's idea of traditionalist leftism or whatever stupid stuff they're coming up with in Germany at the moment. But that's not a way forward either. German capitalism is dying on its feet. British capitalism is in an even worse state. So until we recognize the urgency and the dire situation that we are in and stop engaging in fantasies, which is what the Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn eras were about, those were fantasies of the ability of returning to the social democratic period. So we need to face those facts. So I think we're having some issues there. There was a bit of buffering. So if you see some interruption with the picture, don't worry, it does come back. So moving on, Victor asks, what would a rump Ukrainian republic look like? I've seen various maps that address this point or purport to address this point. The most realistic one I've seen is that the Russians take all of the coastline and that then you end up with a rump Ukraine that consists of essentially Kiev and then the west of Ukraine. The west of Ukraine, in some of these solutions, gets taken into Poland and it gets declared to be like a protectorate or something. And that essentially then you end up with the Kiev area around Kiev and the great middle part of Ukraine acting as essentially a giant neutral zone that will exist between Russia and the forces of NATO. This is something that Medvedev talked about in one of his Telegram posts recently. Potential for having some kind of neutral zone in the middle that would be essentially run by people who are friendly to the Russian Federation and aren't essentially banderists run by the United States. Now, whether any of that is possible is another question. The other thing, of course, that Medvedev keeps going on about is the fact that Kiev is a historically Russian city. So rump Ukraine is a possibility, But I think there's a lot of negotiations needed to go on before that kind of sort of buffer zone state can be created. But it appears to be something that the Russians are open to. Whether the Americans are going to be able to fulfill their commitments there or want to engage in that kind of solution is another question entirely. It may take the removal of Biden to actually get somebody to sign on the line with that. Now, the benefit of having a rump Ukraine there from the American perspective is, of course, that they can claim that the Ukrainian state has survived, when it obviously hasn't. So my theory is that we might not even get that. We may end up in a situation where the Russians take Kiev as well, and then the rest of Ukraine is essentially then signed over to Poland, Hungary, and other countries who break it up between themselves. That may be the ultimate solution there, and that the Russians then create a new border with the former territories of Ukraine that are now occupied by the Eastern European countries. And as I've said before, the advantage of the Russians of having the Poles take Galicia and the Hungarians take Carpathian region and the Romanians take a bit is that now all of these countries suddenly become invested in the breakup of the Ukrainian state and the transition to a new arrangement. And it, of course, thwarts the American plans to then use the Poles as cannon fodder, because can the Polish reactionaries resist the possibility of being able to take Galicia back without firing a shot, which appears to be sometimes what the Russians are essentially offering. So to be decided, but before we can get to a rump Ukrainian state, that the only way that could be agreed is if it was agreed directly with between the Americans and the Russians. And of course, then the Americans would have to get their puppets in line. In my view, the more realistic option is that, again, it's a division between Hungary, Poland, and others, and the Russians, and that these countries then reach a deal between themselves. And perhaps the Americans play an increasingly small part in it, because the American political system won't allow any kind of compromise at this stage. So, Irish Partisan. Colonel McGregor said that Russia, having eroded much of Ukrainian forces, will go on the offensive at a time and place of their choosing, and it could be very soon. Most likely true. When there's no men left, when there's very few supplies left, the Russians could do some kind of lightning move down the coast to seize Odessa, or they could ultimately then threaten Kiev again, because they've got those tens and tens of thousands of men, maybe hundreds of thousands now in Belarus, which haven't moved yet. Who have been training up there for many, many months. So they've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men available to them. They have apparently 1,400 men a day signing up for the Russian military now. And even if you say that, a third of them are deemed unfit for service, well, that's still around about 1,000 a day. That's much more than they're losing. I mean, they're going to end up with an army that's well over 1 million strong. That's more than enough to take what they need to in Ukraine by the time they're ready to go. So, HM says, is there a split amongst the imperialists in the US about going to war with China? I haven't seen any opposition like you do with Russia, where some imperialists want to leave Russia and focus on China. I mean, there is a split. That's why Yellen has gone to Beijing this week to try and do a deal. I think what it was reported that she was offering was that some sanctions on Chinese manufactured goods would be eased or phased out, and that in return for this, the Americans would, the Chinese would buy more dollar bonds, essentially buy more American junk debt. And that's the deal that's being offered, because of course Blinken's trip over there led to absolutely nothing, given that Biden immediately reversed course on whatever agreement that they thought they'd signed over there. So there's a division, though, because not just in America, but in Europe, because as I've covered before, the German ruling class needs China for the assemblage of many of its manufactured goods that are, formally speaking, made in Germany. Well, even the German state media covered years ago now, it must be a decade ago, the fact that a lot of the components of German manufactured goods are all made in China. And they're exported, and the final version is assembled in Germany. Without that, then German manufacturing takes an enormous hit, because suddenly they'll be faced with a scenario where, well, what do? They can't get them manufactured in China. It would take them months or years to find alternative sources in places like maybe Indonesia or Thailand or perhaps Vietnam, where they could have these parts assembled in the same way. And there's going to be a severe damage to their manufacturing capacity whilst that goes on, because, of course, the reason why, or one of the reasons why, the Germans have been able to maintain their manufacturing base is because they outsource so much of the component part construction to China. And without that, they suddenly have to have it done, in Germany again? Well, they won't want that. They retain that industrial base that they do essentially as a final stage production, not like the kind of production from scratch that you would have found 50 years ago. So there's a big split there. There's a big split also because a lot of countries in Europe run by people who have more brains than Giorgia Meloni, for instance, realize that China is going to be an increasingly important part of their economic setup in the future. And this is what Orban in Hungary has realized, and he's about as pro-US as it is possible to get, but he's not stupid. Problem is that the US is still moving an awful lot of capital into Europe. Europe is still the #1 destination for American exported capital. And of course, you've had 75 years now, over 75 years, since the Americans, as Stalin put it, put Europe on rations after World War II. And that's 75 years where they have dominated the political systems of Europe. For all the fake fights that people like de Gaulle and Willy Brandt had with the Americans and the fake disputes and the fallings out from time to time, America still dominates all of these systems. The biggest rebellion was, of course, the temporary rebellion over Iraq, which is a rebellion about tactics, not strategy. And that didn't last too long. And but after Chirac's rebellion, every French president since then has been a cringing servant of American imperialism. So even though they know very well that, like, if they cut off their trade with China, essentially short term, that of course obeys the will of the American master. Long term, it's potentially devastating because they lose the enormous Chinese market, and of course they'll lose the access to the manufactured goods of China, which has become so crucial for a lot of these countries. So it basically means that the economic model they have is finished, which is causing a lot of disputes and a lot of rows to break out in Europe and in the United States itself, where even military professionals are saying they can't separate their supply chains from China in the timelines that, like, politicians in Washington are demanding. But ultimately, this is going to go only one way, which is unless there's significant rebellion inside Europe that fundamentally changes the makeup of the European political system, which removes the US influence there, which I can't see happening, and the current ruling classes staying in power, then you're going to end up with Europe being dragged down the hole with the United States, cutting off its relationships with China, and this is being trailed by the Baltic states, who are all now yapping at China obediently on the command of the American master. So they're going to force this through, and their domination of European political systems means that any rebellion is not likely to succeed. Or if it does, then it's going to create chaos inside Europe as a dispute opens up between various different factions inside the imperial bloc. But so far, the Americans have managed to retain complete dominance over France and Germany and others, even as they lead them towards ever greater damage being done to their own economies. So, Philippos Kasapis says, why are we blaming KKE for pro-Ukraine when it's the only CP which made a mass demonstration these days outside the Ukrainian embassy for the Kononovich brothers? It's a bold thing to do in a NATO country. Well, we're criticizing the KKE for taking a mistaken position on the question of the Ukraine war, given that from the beginning they mistakenly characterized it as an inter-imperialist war when it is not, because Russia isn't an imperialist country. And the arguments made by the KKE are shallow and pathetic, quite frankly. And yes, they do a lot of stuff against NATO, which is should be supported. But their arguments over Russia being an imperialist country are false, and it leads their members and people who are influenced by them into false positions. So it shouldn't be the case that because the KKE does some good things, we should excuse it for taking a false and misleading position when it comes to the nature of modern Russia and it comes to the nature of this war. Their analysis of Russia as an imperialist power is wrong, and not only that, it's wrong to the point where it's an abuse of Marxism to claim that it's a Marxist analysis. It very much is not. I would urge you to read the critique done by other Greek communists outside of the KKE that can be found in the bulletin of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. I will post this in the chat so you can see what's being said by other Greeks about the position taken by the Greek Communist Party, because their position is completely ridiculous. I'll just try and find that now so I can post it into the chat. Let me have a look. It's got to be around here somewhere. So yes, because a party takes one good action doesn't immunize it from criticism. So yes, I'll just post this in here. You can then find the relevant article on that page. It's section 4 of the Anti-Imperialist Platform Bulletin and section 5, I think, which deal with the critique of the Greek Communist Party's position. I'd urge everybody to read it. Zuleika says, postmodernism has desecrated the universities. Independent study is now the only way to gain knowledge, and I say this as a dropout. Many lecturers are concerned with not offending students than with knowledge. Yes, many people have told me that it's just not worth pursuing academia anymore, given that the level of opportunism and short-sightedness, careerism and stupidity that reigns in these places. And of course the students themselves are getting royally ripped off. The undergraduates being charged like what, 8 or 9 grand a year for what, 6 hours contact time a week, sometimes online. It's ridiculous. I mean, it was ridiculous paying $1 grand a year when I went 15 or so years ago when I finished. So it's even more ridiculous now. Irish Partisan says, what do you think about the new BRICS gold-based currency, the details of which is due to be unveiled next month in Johannesburg? Very interesting development to be welcomed if it secures the path towards further de-dollarization and gives countries that have been under siege for years another way to go. I know that the Zimbabweans would be very interested in it. So it's going to be interesting to see the US imperialists' response to this, given that this will be taken up by many countries. It's also interesting that the Argentines paid a lot of their debt to the IMF recently in Chinese yuan. So again, the dollar's place is slowly, or more accurately now, rapidly being eroded as the world reserve currency. Again, the response of the imperialists will be very interesting to observe, given how much their position in the world depends upon them retaining this absolute dominance over the international financial and currency system. So the BRICS meeting is going to be very crucial, as is the NATO meeting coming up. The NATO meeting coming up will most likely be an absolute shit show. There'll be all kinds of rows about Erdogan continuing to block Sweden's entry into NATO, about the support to Ukraine, about what they should do about Ukraine. I mean, just to go back to the whole false flag thing that was floating around regarding the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Well, a big part of that was all about the fact that Zelensky was trying to blackmail the Europeans and the Americans into fast-tracking Ukraine into NATO. But as even Biden himself said, we put Ukraine in NATO, that means we have to go to war with Russia, which they don't want to do. So they're stuck. They're going to try and find a way at Vilnius later this week of evading a decision. They're going to try and make it look as if they've taken some big, bold stance when in actual fact they've probably done very little. So these are the questions facing us in the upcoming week. Like, what does the Vilnius summit actually achieve? I predict that it'll end up being a complete mess, that they'll try and slap a positive spin on it at the end, but they won't be able to agree anything, because you'll have all these different foolish positions being taken, and all these different countries with their competing agendas, and the Americans themselves being divided in their own administration as to the way forward. Some of them want to continue in Russia. Some of them want to continue with regard to staging provocations over Taiwan. And all of them are desperate to avoid the impression that they've lost, which they very much have. So, other thing that I wanted to mention. Question from Philippos. Which do you believe is the social group who's behind the counter-revolution in the USSR? Very long question, but ultimately it was a collection of pro-capitalist forces who emerged. Well, there was always a pro-capitalist sections who were hidden away in the USSR, but they got the right to come out into the open to an extent after 1956 and the Khrushchev secret speech, which essentially declared that the revolutionary period was over, and started a series of pro-capitalist economic reforms, which ultimately did two things. It grew a pro-bourgeois faction at the very top of the Soviet Party, and on the other side, it grew an underground capitalist class who, via illegal methods, were able to restore capitalist production in certain areas of the Soviet Union via corrupt methods that were ushered in thanks to the Khrushchev pro-capitalist reforms. So by the time you get to Gorbachev, really he's a manifestation of a series of material and ideological changes that have gone through since the mid-50s. So you have the pro-capitalist faction within the CPSU, headed by people like Yeltsin and Anatoly Sobchak and various others. Then you have underground the pro-capitalist forces that existed there and were waiting for the opportunity to burst out into the open. Gorbachev, being their useful idiot, gave them the opportunity to do so by essentially allowing capital to be exported out of the Soviet Union by removing the capital controls in 1988, therefore securing a flood of capital out of the country. And so the key forces that restored capitalism inside the USSR were these pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist comprador faction in the CPSU that had grown up through the pro-capitalist reforms in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s. And, of course, then the underground capitalists who had already started restoring capitalist commodity production in the illegal economy. Those two forces coincided together, and then, of course, they blew up the whole thing in 1989 following Gorbachev's so-called democratic reforms, which were actually anti-democratic reforms. So this was these were the forces that were at play in the destruction of the USSR. Gorbachev was just their figurehead. Irish Partisan says, Iran joining the SCO this week was a big deal. There was talk of Belarus joining next year, as well as the BRICS. Bang. Yeah. Now there's alternatives, rapidly growing alternatives to the American system. Though all those who have been targeted by the whims of the American imperialists are going to seek them out, and they're only going to grow, which of course is going to pitch the American imperialist system into an ever greater crisis, which will manifest itself both externally and internally. Internally, the American system is developing an ever greater political crisis because they are openly trying to prevent Trump from running for office again. God knows how far they'll be prepared to go against him. They can't agree on a way forward because a way forward that would actually preserve American capitalism would take fundamental changes within the economic base of the United States, which American imperialism has not actually been prepared to do. Yes, thank you to Zuleika for suggesting I check the live chat there. Okay, yeah, I've missed some questions here, so I'm going to go back over what I've missed. Ash said, what does it say when the ruling class is openly admitting that they might have blown up Nord Stream and the presence of neo-Nazis in Ukrainian ranks? Trying to discipline Ukraine? What about the dam blast? The dam blast was, according to those who've studied this, was a preparation for a potential attack on the power plant. To destroy the dam first, to remove sources of water that would be used for cooling the power plant. They then would move on to attacking the power plant itself. So the Ukrainians are essentially, that was essentially a blackmail move, as I said before. The ruling class openly admitting that someone blew up Nord Stream and the presence of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Well, first of all, the presence of the Nazis is undeniable because they were reporting on this themselves before last year. And it's got to the point now where they can't ignore it anymore, so they're trying to admit it in various different sort of half-assed ways. The Nord Stream thing, I think there's part of the ruling class in the United States that does want to get out of Ukraine. There's part of the ruling government circles that want to get out and just pile into Taiwan. Now, they are more than prepared to throw Zelensky and the entire Maidan regime under the bus in doing so. And if they can pin everything that's gone on, including Nord Stream, on Zelensky, and then basically just leave him to twist in the wind, they'll do so. So this is all products of like a row that's going on behind the scenes in the hierarchy of the American political system. HM says, will a decisive defeat for NATO in Ukraine limit the US ability to go to war with China? Well, that's the big row. That's the nature of the row inside the American system, which is how far do they go in Russia, and do they try and secure some kind of fudge in over Ukraine, some kind of conflict freezing that would allow them to then move to the much bigger enemy for them, the much bigger threat, which is China. But the problem they have is, again, how do they get out of this mess that they have created in Ukraine without looking as if they've lost? That's the big thing, because there was a time when they could have got out of it without looking as if they'd lost. That time was over a year ago, but they blocked that. And there was a time when the Russians were in a position to bargain with the United States, where just Ukraine agreeing not to join NATO and those two regions, formerly Ukrainian regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, going first independent and then probably at some point joining the Russian Federation, that compromise could have been achieved. Now it can't. So the question for the American imperialists is, well, how badly do they want to get out and then move on to China? Without looking weak. But the thing is, the Chinese have studied this and they already know that the American imperialists are weak. They already know that the American imperialist plan for Taiwan is to try and force Japanese militarism to re-emerge and use them as a battering ram with American naval and air support. So yes, a reinvigorated Japanese military fighting the Chinese over Taiwan, yeah, that's going to end well. So they have created a hole for themselves from which they cannot get out. Be interesting to see how the NATO summit goes, if we can discern any ways forward. Do the Americans go into that summit and then just try and point all of NATO towards China and try and slowly phase out the Ukrainian operation? It's going to be interesting to see how it goes down. Philippos says, you mean the capitalists of the shadow economy of the USSR? Vasyulin adds to that, the managers of the factories. Well, yes, the capitalists of the shadow economy emerged in part because the Khrushchev era instituted reforms in the economy that gave the factory managers the power to essentially act as capitalists as long as it was within the wider plan. So we're talking, well, I just finished a reread of Stalin's book, his last book, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, where he talks about this. he talks about the need to further the planned economy. And of course, Khrushchev went in the opposite direction, and Kosygin did as well, of moving towards a system where the factory managers were given complete authority over their facilities. This, of course, and their budgets, and they were rewarded with huge bonuses for meeting production quotas, which had led to all kinds of corruption and fiddling of the figures. It also meant that given that they were given more and more autonomy over the workforce, so they basically essentially ran the factory as dictators, the role of the masses in production was downgraded, leading to all kinds of demoralization in the proletariat. But also that the factory managers were able to essentially, some of them anyway, become capitalists by essentially running private capitalist operations on the side and then fiddling the figures that went back to the Central Planning Committee, Gosplan, and pretending that they weren't. So this layer of illegal capitalists emerged directly from the Khrushchev era, which gave the factory managers more power over their budgets and more autonomy over their factories and their production quotas. And all that led to was the restoration of capitalism in many different areas, or the restoration of capitalism in micro form, so that these people were a solid pro-capitalist faction within the party and the state by 1985, who were just waiting for the opportunity that a Gorbachev figure would provide to them to fully restore capitalism. So, thanks to Zuleika for reminding me to check the live chat. Peter says, American imperialism's con of bringing freedom and democracy to nations it then plunders and bullies hasn't won it long-standing friends and allies. Given a chance, they'll flush it around the U-bend. Correct. They certainly will. It hasn't won them any friends whatsoever other than in tiny comprador cliques. Richard Arce and the others in the State Department want to freeze the conflict, but on their terms. They don't seem to realise that Moscow now sets the terms. Yes. They think that they can go and dictate a solution by saying, look, we'll freeze the conflict along the line X, Y, and Z, and that'll be the case. But as I said, not only is it the case that Moscow can set the terms, Moscow must set the terms, and they can't be agreeing to the onerous terms that Haas and others will be trying to impose. And also the Americans are in no position to impose terms on the Russian Federation now, given everything that's gone on and given the domestic political situation inside Russia. So these are difficult things. They can't find a way forward here with regard to freezing the conflict on terms that would enable the American imperialists to look as if they were presenting a victory of some kind, because it's not going to be. It really isn't. So, been going now for an hour and 55. Are there any final questions, or should we call it a day there? Because I've got various other things I've got to get on with. So unless there's anything else, I'm going to call it a day there, and then we'll reconvene tomorrow at 7:30 British time. Right, okay. So yes, it'll be one live stream per day for the rest of this week. There will be the second part of the live stream on Stalin's work, Anarchism or Socialism. That'll be coming up this week as well. So, and there'll be the coverage of the NATO conference. So be sure to tune in for that. But until then, thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks to everybody in the chat. I'll go through everybody. Peter, Ash, Irish Partisan, Jerry, my comrade Jason from the Class Consciousness Project. Again, check out the Class Consciousness Project for a meltdown caused yesterday by our posts criticising Khrushchevite revisionism. Go look at the post and you'll see what I mean. Apparently, Khrushchevites still don't think you should criticise bureaucrats. Red Star Betty, Oswhistles, Peter, Roddy, Victor, and HM, and Zuleika again. Thank you, everybody. I'll be back again with you tomorrow.